You're going to die having done very little with the time you had. Not because you were lazy, not because you lacked ambition, but because you spent most of your life preparing to live instead of living. This thought doesn't arrive as panic. It arrives quietly. Late at night, when you're alone and the day is finally over. When you check the time and feel pressure without knowing why. When weeks move quickly, yet nothing feels finished. On the surface, things are fine. You're functioning. You're handling responsibilities. Nothing is obviously broken. But there's a background tension you can't shake. A sense that life is slightly ahead of you. The decisions are piling up faster than you're making them. You don't think, I'm wasting my life. That would sound dramatic. The thought is more subtle, more reasonable. I just need more clarity. I don't want to make the wrong move. I'll start once things make sense. So you wait. Waiting feels responsible, thoughtful, even intelligent. It feels safer than committing too early or choosing poorly. But time doesn't pause while you think. Days begin to feel expensive. Simple choices carry unusual weight. Small decisions feel like they might close doors permanently. You've felt this when you delay starting something important because you're still figuring it out. You've felt it when free time makes you uneasy instead of relaxed. You've felt it when progress feels urgent, but direction feels unclear. This isn't laziness. It isn't a lack of ambition. It isn't because you don't care. It's a specific anxiety tied to time. An anxiety that convinces you every move must be optimized because mistakes feel irreversible and time feels scarce. And that anxiety creates a trap. The fear of wasting your life slowly becomes the reason you don't step fully into it. To move forward, you have to understand what this fear actually is and why it feels so convincing, even when nothing is technically wrong. This fear has a name, even if most people never learn it. It's time anxiety. Not the fear that you're busy, not the fear that you're tired, but the fear that time is passing and you're not creating enough value with it. Time anxiety doesn't ask whether you're enjoying your life. It asks whether your life will justify itself later. That question sits quietly in the background of everything you do. It's why relaxation feels undeserved, why rest feels like delay, why free time creates discomfort instead of relief. You've felt this when you try to relax but keep checking the clock, when you feel guilty for doing nothing, even after a long day, when you can't enjoy progress because it doesn't feel fast enough. The problem isn't that you want a meaningful life. That's normal. The problem is that meaning has been turned into a performance metric. Modern life trains you to treat time like a resource that must be optimized. Every hour should produce something measurable. Every choice should move you closer to a future version of yourself that's finally enough. So instead of living time, you monitor it. You evaluate your days while you're still inside them. You judge your progress before it's had a chance to compound. You worry about outcomes while you're still at the starting line. That constant evaluation drains attention. The mind stays tense because it's always asking, is this the best use of my time? And when that question never shuts off, action becomes risky. You hesitate, not because you're afraid of effort, but because effort feels expensive. Because choosing one path feels like losing all the others. Time anxiety doesn't paralyze you by making you careless. It paralyzes you by making you careful. And the more careful you become, the harder it feels to move at all. This is why the fear is so convincing. It sounds intelligent, responsible, forward-thinking, but it isn't protecting your future. It's quietly keeping you from entering your present. At first, time anxiety feels useful. It makes you think ahead. It pushes you to be intentional. It convinces you that you're being careful with your life. But over time, the effect reverses. The mind starts treating every decision as permanent. Every choice feels like it must justify years of future consequences. And when the stakes feel that high, hesitation becomes the default response. You've felt this when you delay starting something because you want to choose the right version of it. When you keep refining plans instead of acting on them. When you stay in analysis long after information stopped being the problem. This is how the fear of wasting time quietly wastes it. Not through distraction, through over-optimization. Instead of moving and correcting, you wait for certainty. Instead of experimenting, you rehearse. Instead of learning by contact, you try to think your way into the correct life. The mind begins to treat action as risk and preparation as safety. That's when procrastination takes on a strange quality. It no longer feels lazy. It feels strategic, responsible, even mature. But something important gets lost. When you delay action in the name of optimization, you also delay feedback. You delay friction. You delay the kind of information that only shows up once you're already moving. Progress becomes abstract. You think about changing your life more than you experience it. You imagine future versions of yourself more than you inhabit your current one. You stay mentally busy while remaining physically still. Over time, this creates a subtle internal split. Part of you feels urgency. Another part of you resists commitment. That tension is exhausting. And because nothing is obviously wrong, you assume the problem must be internal. That you're unmotivated, undisciplined, or broken in some way. But the issue isn't a lack of drive. It's that your mind has been trained to treat life as something to get right before you're allowed to live it. And that mindset turns time from a medium you move through into a judge you're constantly standing in front of. This fear doesn't grow in hardship. It grows in comfort. When life is unstable, attention narrows. You respond to what's in front of you. Decisions are forced. Time feels structured because something needs to be handled now. But when life becomes comfortable, time opens up. There are fewer external pressures telling you what matters. Fewer deadlines that insist on action. More flexibility, more options, more room to choose later. That sounds like freedom. Psychologically, it creates friction. Without external necessity, the mind has to decide what deserves effort, and that decision never fully resolves. Something else always seems possible. Something better always seems just out of reach. You've felt this when having free time made you restless instead of calm. When weekends felt heavier than weekdays. When nothing demanded your attention, yet your mind refused to settle. Comfort removes urgency, but it doesn't remove expectation. Instead, expectation turns inward. You start asking questions that don't have clear answers. What should I be doing with my life? Is this the best use of my time? Am I falling behind without realizing it? These questions don't guide action. They suspend it. The more freedom you have, the more responsibility you feel for choosing perfectly. And when every option looks meaningful, committing to one feels like sacrificing the others. This is why people with the most flexibility often feel the most pressure. They're not exhausted from effort. They're exhausted from evaluation. Time anxiety thrives in environments where nothing insists and everything negotiates. Where days blend together without clear endings. Where tasks remain open, revisable, and mentally active long after you stop working. The mind never gets a signal that it's finished, so it stays alert, scanning, reassessing, waiting for clarity. And that constant readiness quietly drains your energy. Not because you're doing too much, but because nothing ever feels fully done. This is how a life that looks easy from the outside begins to feel heavy on the inside. This is where the pattern becomes hard to ignore. Your mind isn't exhausted because you're doing too much. It's exhausted because nothing ever fully ends. Work spills into rest. Rest dissolves into distraction. Distraction leaves a residue of guilt. Even when you stop, your mind doesn't register completion. There's always something pending. A message you could respond to. A task you could refine. A decision you could reconsider. The mind treats anything unfinished as active. That's how mental energy leaks, not through effort, but through unresolved relevance. Earlier forms of life had natural stopping points. Tasks concluded. Days closed. Responsibilities had edges. When something was finished, it actually finished. Now, most things remain open-ended, editable, accessible at all times. There's always another version you could improve, another option you could evaluate, another future you could prepare for. So the mind stays partially engaged, even during rest. You've felt this when lying down, but not feeling settled. When free time still feels occupied. When finishing something doesn't bring relief, only the next consideration. This is the realization most people miss. If nothing ever truly ends, then you never fully arrive anywhere. Not in your work, not in your rest, not even in your progress. Everything feels provisional, temporary, like a draft that never gets submitted. The exhaustion people feel today isn't dramatic or explosive. It's quiet and cumulative. It's the fatigue of carrying too many open loops at once. This changes how you live. You begin choosing what feels manageable over what feels meaningful. You avoid depth because depth demands commitment. You keep options open because closing them feels risky. Not because you're afraid of effort, but because effort now feels expensive. Once this becomes clear, the problem shifts. The issue isn't discipline. It isn't productivity. It isn't motivation. It's that your mind is spending enormous energy staying ready, tracking what's unfinished and preparing for what might matter next. And no amount of rest can restore a system that never receives permission to be done. This is where the problem becomes clearer and harder to ignore. The things that were supposed to make life easier are also the things keeping this pressure alive. Convenience removes friction. Technology removes delay. Freedom removes obligation. None of this is harmful on its own, but together, they create a life where nothing insists. When nothing insists, everything negotiates. Every action becomes optional. Every commitment feels reversible. Every direction stays provisional, so the mind is forced into constant arbitration. It has to decide, again and again, what deserves attention, what can wait, and what might matter later. That process never ends. You've felt this. When starting something feels heavier than continuing it. When even simple choices require justification. When motivation doesn't appear unless conditions feel perfect. This is the subtle shift most people miss. Earlier, effort was heavy because it was demanded. Now, effort is heavy because it must be self-generated and constantly defended. Hesitation starts to feel like intelligence. Delay feels like prudence. Keeping options open feels like control. But what's actually happening is erosion. Confidence weakens without obvious failure. Ambition shrinks without resistance. Action slows, not because you've lost capability, but because everything now feels like it costs more than it should. Ease doesn't remove pressure. It relocates it. From the outside to the inside. Nothing pushes you forward. Nothing releases you to rest. Everything stays open. So even in comfort, the mind remains alert. Ease, taken too far, doesn't calm the nervous system. It trains it to stay on standby. And a system trained to hesitate will eventually experience opportunity itself as weight. Not because opportunity is bad, but because every choice now feels like something you might regret choosing incorrectly. This is how a life that looks easy on the surface quietly becomes harder to live inside. At this point, most people reach a familiar conclusion. They assume the problem is a lack of meaning. Life feels heavy, so they conclude it must be empty. Rest feels unsatisfying, so they assume they need more purpose. Discomfort appears, so they search for something larger to chase. That conclusion feels logical. It's also incomplete. The real problem isn't that modern life has too little meaning. It's that it presents too much of it at once. Too many paths that could matter. Too many identities you could grow into. Too many futures asking to be evaluated. Nothing is allowed to be insignificant anymore. Every message feels potentially important. Every opportunity feels like it could be decisive. Every choice feels like it might permanently shape who you become. So the mind stays open, alert, responsive, reluctant to close doors. You've felt this when even rest feels like a decision, when stillness carries guilt, when doing nothing feels like choosing against something else. This isn't emptiness, it's oversignificance. When everything presents itself as meaningful, attention fragments, energy spreads thin, action slows. Even leisure becomes complicated, because relaxing means choosing not to engage with something else that might matter. Earlier in life, meaning ended naturally. Some things were clearly unimportant. Most moments didn't demand interpretation. Now, meaning never closes on its own. And a mind that's asked to care about everything eventually experiences life itself as heavy. Once this becomes clear, the direction of the solution changes. The answer isn't to add more meaning. It's to allow some things to become unimportant again, because the mind doesn't collapse when it has nothing to care about. It collapses when it's asked to care about everything. When people misunderstand what's happening, they try to fix it in the wrong direction. They chase more comfort, more optimization, more distraction, more ease. They assume that once life becomes smooth enough, the pressure will finally lift. But each layer of ease quietly deepens the problem. Ease doesn't reduce significance. It multiplies it. When everything is accessible, nothing closes. When nothing closes, the mind stays involved. When the mind stays involved, rest never fully arrives. This is why people feel oddly restless during periods of comfort and unexpectedly grounded during moments of real responsibility. Not because difficulty is pleasant, but because difficulty collapses relevance. It tells the mind, this matters now. The rest can wait. Ease never does that. It leaves everything open. So the mind compensates by staying vigilant. It monitors options, tracks relevance, and avoids full commitment. Not out of indecision, but out of overload. Over time, this starts to reshape behavior. Not consciously, not dramatically, quietly. And because the change is gradual, it often gets mistaken for maturity, for realism, for being practical. But it isn't. It's adaptation to an environment that never asks you to commit and never tells you when you're done. This is the real cost of misunderstanding the problem. Not collapse, not burnout, but a slow narrowing of life disguised as comfort. Once you see that, chasing ease stops looking like relief and starts looking like the very thing keeping the weight in place. When this pattern is seen, something shifts, not dramatically, but decisively. Life doesn't suddenly become easier. Your responsibilities don't disappear. Your schedule doesn't open up, but the weight changes. Because the mind is no longer trying to carry everything at once. When you recognize that exhaustion comes from oversignificance, attention begins to reorganize on its own. You stop treating every option as urgent and every possibility as meaningful. Some things quietly lose their grip. You've felt this when a choice finally becomes simple, not because it's easy, but because it's clear. When effort stops leaking into everything else. When rest feels like rest again. This isn't motivation, it's orientation. When effort has a center, it stops draining outward. When attention has limits, it stops scattering. When meaning is contained, it becomes solid instead of heavy. This is why certain difficult lives feel strangely light. Not because they're free of pressure, but because pressure is directed. Energy moves towards something instead of diffusing across everything. Commitment replaces hesitation. Clarity replaces constant evaluation. The mind stops negotiating with itself because it knows what matters and what doesn't. And when that happens, rest changes too. Rest no longer feels like avoidance. It no longer carries guilt. It no longer feels provisional. Because the mind understands what it's resting from and what it's allowed to ignore. Nothing mystical happens here. No reinvention. No new identity, just alignment. A shift from managing everything to carrying something. And carrying something meaningful, even when it's heavy, is far easier than trying to carry everything all at once. Once this is understood, it doesn't fade. Not because it's dramatic, but because it explains too much to ignore. The fear you've been carrying was never about laziness or lack of ambition. It wasn't proof that something was wrong with you. It was the result of treating time as something to optimize instead of something to live inside. Modern life never tells you what can be set down. So your mind tried to hold everything. Every possibility stayed open. Every alternative remained relevant. Every future demanded consideration. That effort felt like anxiety. That vigilance felt like pressure. That confusion felt like failure. Now the structure is visible. And when the structure is visible, drifting stops being accidental. From here on, what you continue to worry about becomes a choice. What you keep open becomes deliberate. What you give attention to carries responsibility. This isn't about doing more. It isn't about doing less. It's about deciding what your life is organized around. Because time doesn't disappear when you stop thinking about it. It stops haunting you when you stop treating it like a scoreboard. A meaningful life is not built by maximizing outcomes. It's built by committing to directions that justify the days spent walking them. That commitment will close doors. It will make some opportunities irrelevant. It will disappoint certain versions of who you could have been. That is not loss, that is definition. Life becomes lighter when it stops trying to be everything at once. Not because weight disappears, but because it finally has shape. Clarity doesn't remove uncertainty. It makes uncertainty tolerable. And once you see that, you don't go back to living as if every moment must prove its worth. This understanding doesn't solve everything. You'll still hesitate. You'll still wonder if you're choosing correctly. You'll still feel the pull of other paths. But the difference is this. You'll know the hesitation isn't protecting you. You'll know the wondering isn't preparation. You'll know the weight you've been carrying wasn't the cost of ambition. It was the cost of never choosing. And once you see that, the choice becomes simple. Not easy. Simple. You stop treating your life like something that needs to be perfected before it can be lived. You stop waiting for the fear to give you permission. You just start. And the life you were afraid of wasting? It starts the moment you stop being afraid to waste it. If this made sense to you, you already know why you're here. We'll talk again.